group for Google Hangout 2, and welcome to my feedback to you. I just wanted to tell you that this Hangout was very lively, and you all contributed, and everybody. Obviously, you probably heeded my comments on the first one. It was very well run, and Kadeem, good wrap up after each question. You came up with something to add to that. So the way you had it organized and timed, and you exhausted the questions for most part. I don't think you asked the one on Homeland Security and the legislation. The one that asked about the Freedom Act, I don't think you covered that, but generally you offered a very exhaustive overview and answers to the questions that I posed for you. So I enjoyed listening to it, and let me just give you a brief overview of some of the things, or wrap up of some of the things that you discussed. So as far as politicization of intelligence, Judge, I think you discussed how it's difficult to win with the politicians and policymakers because they are political animals, and because intelligence, the way Loventhal explains it to us, is a process that is to serve and propel the policymaker and the administration. So obviously it is going to be a process that is going to be politicized. And so you had Rhonda, you talked about the idealistic model of how the intelligence community and a policymaker have to work with one another in a way that there is that line that separates them, so they the analyst doesn't make policy decisions, and the policymaker should rely on pure analysis of the issues that's presented to them. And of course, it is the idealistic line, because as you see from Loventhal, he discusses the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and how, you know, in different administrations, it's a lot of times about personalities, and how you know, different directors of national intelligence or central intelligence, you know, before the DNI office, either had access to the president or didn't have access to the president, either had the president's ear or didn't have a president's ear. And you can even talk about politicization of intelligence today, and you know, you can see the major player in intelligence community, the director of Federal Bureau of Investigations, gets, you know, released on you know, because of lack of affinity of current president for him. So obviously those issues are going to be plaguing the intelligence process, if you can say it so. So for us to think, you know, we have to think that, yes, the concept is idealistic, and how we mitigate and how we manage those lines of communication between the policymaker and the intelligence community and the owner of the product, or the community that came up with the intelligence product. You know, it's there's a lot of factors that affect that. Kadeem, you wanted to know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Well, you know, obviously it depends. It depends if we want to, you know, it starts with the requirements, truly, and it is the prerogative of the president of this country to determine what their priorities for targeting whatever national security issues will be, based on their foreign policy, based on their political agenda. So in a way, they're already from the start the owner of that product and the shaper of that intelligence process because of what they want. They're going to decide what they want that intelligence analyst to bring them. You know, those agents do not go in the field and collect what they want. They collect what's required of them. So in itself, they are the arm of the government. So depending how you think about the government, it's going to, you know, dictate whether it's good or bad. You know, if that's a lawyer question. answer to the question for you. Judge, you don't think that they do work well? Well, again, it depends on personalities. It depends on a clout. It depends on previous relationships, whether they would work together well or not. Kayla was mentioning something about policies, not and guidelines, and saying that the policy is just a guideline. I think I very strongly disagree with that. Policies are not guidelines. Policies are policies. Policies are actually set so they can give direction for decision making. Guidelines are totally different. Guidelines are not as formalized. So there is definitely a difference, and policy setting is a serious matter. It is what sets the course for a lot of those federal agencies. So that's really important to keep in mind. Maria, you talked about the fact that the information goes one way but not the other, and that was also mentioned by Treverton, that the intelligence community supplies the product, but the policymaker does not feel obligated to share all the decisions with the intelligence community. The intelligence community pushes it up. The policymaker does not necessarily have to push it down. And that's certainly the case. Again, because the policymaker ultimately is the consumer of that intelligence product, and the intelligence community works at the pleasure of the policymaker. And of course, with that, policymakers do tend to have a double advantage over that. Kadeem mentioned that, I think, over the intelligence community. Intelligence community is more instrumental than in a power role, which is the way it was set up in the first place. You had some conversation about the issues with the WMDs and the way the questions were posed by the administrations, that they were already biased in a way. So even then, when the Operation Curveball happened, and even though Curveball was not properly vetted and it was dubious whether he had access, and even though the Germans were saying that that was a flaw, that it wasn't 100% triangulated, this was accepted because there was this cognitive bias that this is what they were looking for validation of the expectation. So even though it wasn't, as far as methods, the most reliable intelligence, it was fulfilling the requirement. And so it was used. And Rhonda refers to that as cherry picking. Obviously, it happens, and it happens in research too. And I'm sure that when you write your papers, you are looking for sources that are, or if you have political opinions of some sort, you're looking for sources that validate your expectations, and you use those sources, and then you tend to not put as much weight on the sources that don't agree with your expectations or your political views. So those you tend to put down or find fault with them. And it's very similar, in saying research has to be unbiased, but inherently it is biased because we have our preferences. So Maria was talking about how, based on if we were to take the proper intelligence cycle process and have the right questions asked in a WMD scenario, Treverton says, we should have never gone there. And so the intel process was greatly politicized. So then you talked about the discussion whether intelligence processes that are domestic should be local. And I think that there was, maybe you were puzzled by the way the question was posed. And the reason I asked that question is because I want you to think about, given a history of intelligence in the United States being mainly at the federal level, right, since 1947, being mainly at the federal level. So you're looking at the intelligence community, and that community was, partly the 800-pound gorilla in the house, which is DOD, and then other agencies, to a very, very small, until 2004, to some extent, in foreign counterintelligence, FBI, not as much domestic. Only after 2004 has FBI did it take the lead, because we didn't have a domestic intelligence agency. So when you think about the domestic intelligence, again, historically, law enforcement has not been part of it. And so when I ask the question, should domestic intelligence be in the purview of local law enforcement, I want you to really think whether local law enforcement is properly equipped to handle that. Not necessarily whether they are a logical choice, because they are. And we have discussed that they are a logical choice, because they are on the ground, because they have access, because they know the community, and all those reasons that you mentioned. They are going to be the first ones to respond to an event. And the lone wolves and radicalized persons, they live in our communities. That's where it starts, right? So the awareness of those issues starts at local level. But that is a different question than asking whether those local police are equipped to be gathering intelligence in the first place. And I think that's an open question that has to do with their traditional way they work and handle criminal cases, at history of intelligence and internal security in the United States. You talked about the big city having, the officers probably are equipped to do that. There are New York PD or LAPD would have specialized divisions that are counter-terrorism division, or criminal intelligence divisions, or specialized divisions that have resources to handle matters of homeland security, domestic security, and being able to deal with it collection at the ground level, right? But what about those small police departments? And then I think Kayela was talking about the fact that maybe it's not necessarily, and I like that point, but maybe it's not necessarily about should local law enforcement be a collector, but it's more about the coordination. To what extent is the local law enforcement engaged with other entities that will eventually come to coordinate with them at that local level? So if the local law enforcement is engaged with state and federal, they will have access to better training, to free training, to some grants, to networking, to sharing, to leveraging resources or sharing resources, because that police department might not be resourced to even be able to get training on terrorism, or how to detect something in your community, or what does it mean to be radicalized. What are the telltales of somebody cooking something very dangerous or making a pipe bomb. So that's a very good point. That's where coordination and collaboration comes in. So it's not necessarily about, it's local law enforcement, but to what degree and how the local law enforcement can get help with that new mission. And I really like that. Willing to share. I'm not sure who discussed that. Perhaps it was Kadeem. You talked about the drug trade. and the collaboration, that the local law enforcement will know about those drug networks that exist in a community. They have that criminal intelligence, right, on what's going on, and that is and that can be leveraged. But again, unless you have something that you can prosecute, unless you can build a criminal case, local law enforcement doesn't really deal much with that collection phase, that prevent mission area. And what I want you to think about as far as intelligence, the way we are discussing it, that intelligence gathering is a little bit different than criminal intelligence. Criminal intelligence is what happened after the marathon bombing happened, and you have all those different agencies, and now they are collaborating on getting and putting those pieces of the puzzle together, because now you have a puzzle. Now you actually have, there were perpetrators, there were bits and pieces, there were people injured, there is consequences, there is, it happened in this particular area, that was the component that was used, and so on and so forth. That's a response. That's after the fact. That is where we have loss. What we're talking about with intelligence is that prevent, the before, the countering, the trying to anticipate, trying to predict, trying to hypothesize, trying to predict, which is not necessarily very scientific, which is not evidence-based, which is not necessarily as traditional law enforcement is. So this is really problematic, because it's a different thinking, it's a different philosophy. And typically, law enforcement has been reactive. Something happens and there is a response, but not necessarily doing all those things before, again, because of resources. And, when you go from call to call for service, it's very difficult to start thinking about, all those missions of prevention in your community that you do free educational programs and things like that. So, again, coordination, collaboration with those other entities that are maybe better trained to do that is really critical, because this is how it's going to get, how those processes are going to take root, perhaps. George, you talked about how you work with state troopers, joint task force for gangs, and you had some limited access to intelligence. And Maria talked at length about the small groups and clearances for small groups on need-to-know basis. And I think that you were getting towards, discussing fusion centers. Representative groups of local law enforcement with the need to know and clearances. Trevorton mentions the issue of clearances and fusion centers or clearances at local level and how long it takes. And it's been a really big hindering block for information sharing. Judge, you talked a lot about how a lot of stuff happens behind the curtains, and it takes time of building trust with those other agencies. So, of course, certain law enforcement officers with longevity, with experience, will be better positioned or better suited to get access. So it's not necessarily happening at all levels. It's, Maria drove at that and Judge drove at that it's very specialized units that are going to have this know-how in the community. Maria was talking about the location of FBI in different areas, and I think that there is quite a lot that can be said about that. We say federal law enforcement doesn't really know the community. They are not in the community. They are not aware of the issues of the community like local law enforcement does. But there are 56 field offices of federal agents that work a particular communities. And then there are also resident offices, resident agencies. Conroe has one, Bryan has one, Victoria City has one, to name a few. So in some areas, those, depending on the relationship between local law enforcement and the FBI, that could be a strong presence of federal element that is very well aware of what's going on, because they have worked with those joint task forces on the local drug trade or whatever, and so they know the local composition very well. So I think that's a very good discussion, that if nothing else, those fusion centers have created a platform for a lot of those joint efforts, and those joint efforts do two things. They allow local law enforcement to be better equipped to deal with homeland security issues, and it allows also to the Fed to be better equipped to help and support the locals, because they have built those relationships and they know them and they have that trust. So I think that was, really interesting discussion you had. You had a little bit of a discussion about clearances, and depending on who you know, I'm not really sure if this is truly about who you know as much as it is, certain agencies set priorities and look at specialized units in their agencies of who might be best suited to be part of a task force. It's a commitment of a resource. So for a small agency, it's a very critical decision who they're going to send. It's going to be somebody that knows how to develop relationships, that knows how to network, that knows what to look out for. So obviously, it's not everybody will sit in a fusion center. Otherwise, fusion centers would should very fast explode, because they would have to collocate all the people. So it's going to be a small group, and it's going to be based on qualifications and the needs of the agency. But I don't think that it's about who you know. And maybe it happens, just like corruption happens in some police departments, just like there is lack of integrity of some police officers. Maybe that happens, but it's a lot more of an exception than the rule. When you talked about fusion centers challenges, Rhonda mentioned that she doesn't actually think that they are sharing based on the article, and I think that you really need to be a little bit more specific than that. What I think the fusion centers do well, they collect a lot of information from the local level, and perhaps on the part of disseminating it back, they target only specific agencies that have a need to know. So that has been a complaint of a lot of local police departments, that they send their representatives to those fusion centers, and they give a lot and they give a lot and they give a lot, and then they don't get a whole lot back as far as a product, as an intelligence product, or very actionable intelligence for them that's specifically tailored to them. And so ultimately, it's a big investment and doesn't always have a return at the local level. And that's one of the shortcomings. Judge was talking about issues between FBI and CIA in the past with sharing. I think that that's, pretty much history now. There are still some issues with, who is responsible for what type of intelligence, in the intelligence community, and who thinks that they are a bigger part of intelligence collection, whether it is NSA, for the SIGINT, what Department of Homeland Security truly has as far as intelligence gathering capacity. So maybe there are still those questions in the intelligence community. I think FBI and CIA have very distinct missions. FBI is for domestic intelligence collection, CIA is for foreign, and they are very heavily regulated, but they are working together because of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and DNI structure and those centers that have been created. So this is a sort of, a bygone. What we're talking now talking about the domestic intelligence, how you bring the other elements of law enforcement, and particularly the private sector, because when you think about our homeland security, 90% of critical infrastructure, according to some, is in the hands of the private sector. That's probably more relevant than streamlining federal agencies, how they talk to one another. You know, that happens at the level of analysis of intel and diffuse intel, and you had readings on that and discussion board on that. It is more now about how federal and local sort of work with one another. So not all fusion centers have access to intelligence. I'm not sure what you were driving at here. I think that some arguments made in the article that you did not bring out is, you know, who is in charge, legal issues, accountability issues, assessment, benchmarks, guidelines, standards of operation, norms of operations for fusion centers. Those are some of the things you did not mention. Guidelines, explanation of definitions. The all hazards discussion, Judge was mentioning that you can't prepare for all eventualities, and that might be true, but the all hazards is, you know, eventually you cannot convince all those different people that contribute to fusion centers that their first priority is terrorism, because it is not for most of them, and it will never be for most of them. The probability of terrorism event in any particular jurisdiction is very low. Now, the consequences, if you learned how to assess risk and do risk assessments, the consequences are very high. But still, terrorism falls right in the middle for most, you know, jurisdictions in the United States. Take out, you know, those big, large cities that have critical infrastructure and symbolic venues and symbolic icons of, you know, patriotism and Americanism. Taking those out, for most jurisdictions, terrorism is really not a concern. However, it's there, and it's in that middle range because of possible consequences when it does happen. But there's a whole range of other issues that every jurisdiction deals with. You know, gangs you talked about, you know, the controlled substances, transnational violent networks, the lone wolves, active shooters, and so the all hazards allows for building capabilities, and not being so focused on terrorism would allow those jurisdictions to have more buy-in into sending people to the fusion centers and to participate in a fusion center, because now you're building capability. It doesn't matter what the event is going to be. If you are working together, if you're creating collaborative agreements, if you are making plans about transportation, if you are making decisions about how information is going to be distributed to people in the event something happens, then it doesn't matter what kind of event you're dealing with. And I think that fusion centers should have the all hazards role, or they will not have a role at all in the future. Now, obviously, terrorism is very high on a security agenda. It's going to remain high on a security agenda. But again, it cannot be the only focus, because you're going to lose all those people that every day do not really deal with it. And it, you know, and it doesn't happen. So that's where that all hazard comes in, that when you prepare for all kinds of different eventualities, you're building capabilities. And those capabilities are going to be the same, regardless whether you're dealing with a terrorist event or a catastrophic bridge collapse, because you still have to move people, you still have hospitals, you still have public information, you still have some kind of investigations, whether they are criminal or not criminal. You don't know why that bridge went down. So those are things to consider. Kadeem talked about intelligence cycle. He had a little bit discussion on bomb threats in the hospitals. I'm not really sure if it was still about the all hazards approach, what that was about. But as far as fusion centers and being able to assemble strategic intelligence, I think that Rhonda said they are not meeting the mission. Judge was talking about the fact that they do help at least with that information sharing, and they at least are there and they are talking to one another, so they are building certain capability. But you still go back to 9/11. I really want to know. We are 17 years after 9/11. I would like to have some specifics how we're not meeting the mission or meeting the mission. And maybe first of all, what is the definition of a mission, and is there one? Because the article that you had to read really challenged the notion. Then you had a discussion on SARS, suspicious activity reports. Kayla said that they were very, very useful because they list potential things to look for. I think that when you talk about suspicious activity reports, there's different types. You talked about the ones that the local law enforcement feeds to fusion centers. Suspicious activity reports are also in the finance industry. So those are the ones that the financial institutions share with FinCEN. And they are the ones that raise the flags for different types of financial transactions that helps again in homeland security efforts. But also there is a notion of suspicious activity reports that come back from fusion centers to local jurisdictions. So and they can be distributed at the local level once they are analyzed and produced as a product. And just to give you an example, you're getting from a fusion center a product that says that several municipalities reported that there's been neighborhoods where people were raising awareness about something, and they wanted to know from residents if they had firefighters or police officers living in the area because they really wanted to highlight their value in that particular initiative. And it turned out that it was not clear what the organization was that was sending those people, what was the purpose of those visits, and the fusion center that sent the report said that there is a suspicion that this is a canvassing of neighborhoods to learn where the first responders were for possible targeting. So this kind of report goes back to local jurisdictions, and that's very useful as a product. So suspicious activity reports not only are the ones that are fed to the fusion center, but they're also the ones that come back. And the ones that do come back are not always as actionable. This one is a good example, but there's a lot of stuff that comes back that's not very useful to a particular community. Public industry. You had a good conversation on the fact that public industry doesn't really know truly what, if you see something, say something. Public industry is very diversified, has all kinds of different critical infrastructure pieces. And so for each corporation or a business, there might be different things that are going to be important to note for them or to share. So what are the guidelines for sharing? Maria was talking about the leaking threat to competitors, and that's a very good observation because this is looking at private sector as being reluctant to share because they want to protect their intellectual capacity, their research and development, their proprietary information. And when you think about cases like Office of Personnel Management a couple years ago, the federal records going bust through a cybersecurity breach, then it could be a concern for private sector they're coming to the table and sharing this information. How safeguarded is it from the government? Because, we typically think about, can the private maintain the secrecy of this data that is shared to them by those federal agencies, but how the other way around? And then you have cases like the Apple situation with San Bernardino murderer's phone, and how that was a challenge because Apple was not about to divulge its patent and proprietary information because they have a brand to uphold and they have a customer base that needs to trust in their product. So they were not about to sell that out to federal government just because there is a suspicion that there might be something on that phone. So very interesting case, by the way, as far as intelligence, private-public intelligence sharing. And I encourage you to review the case because it shows you how problematic that partnership can be. You had a discussion on policy making and reactive versus proactive philosophy. Rhonda talked about preparedness. So again, you went to, at the end, you wrapped it up to that prevent or pre-event mission area. And you talked about preparedness, and perhaps it all boils down to, at the end, is that preparedness for being in that on the front end of events is what builds people resilience to when actually something does happen. They have those communications and those lines of relationships in place so they can work with them. So overall, you covered the topics. I would have wished you had more details and arguments from the ACLU article on assessment, accountability, and potential pitfalls of fusion centers, because we can all agree that they do bring people to the table. But 17 years after 9/11, perhaps we need to be a little bit more critical about how they function, how they are structured, what kind of definitions they follow, what are their specific goals, what are their deliverables, and how do we assess if they are meeting their mission or not, because the clear assessments are not available. So I thank you for your participation, and I'm looking forward to watching your third Google Hangout. Thanks.